So Princess Anne just detonated what might be the most elegant atomic bomb in royal family history. And the thing that makes this whole situation absolutely wild is not even the tiara itself. It is that Camilla's reaction in front of the entire assembled royal family essentially confirmed everything Princess Anne had been quietly investigating for months. Like if you are trying to prove you had nothing to do with erasing Diana's legacy. Maybe do not scream at the top of your lungs that someone has no right to honor that legacy in front of 200 witnesses. That is where this whole thing gets genuinely out of control. Before we get into the details, though, make sure to subscribe to Royal Daily Report so you do not miss any updates on this story. Okay, let us break this down. The scene itself was supposed to be a small, intimate ceremony at Buckingham Palace. May 2026. Sunlight streaming through those massive stained glass windows. The whole family gathered for what they had been told was a modest event, honoring Princess Charlotte on her 11th birthday. That is it. Happy birthday. Here is some cake. Everyone smile for the cameras. But Princess Anne had completely different plans. And honestly, the more you look at what she actually did versus how everyone reacted, the clearer it becomes that this was never really about a birthday party. Anne stepped onto the platform with what witnesses described as her trademark firm demeanor. Dark suit, hair pulled back in that no-nonsense bun she has worn for decades, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. In her hands was an old red velvet box, the kind that does not contain casual gifts. Next to her stood 11-year-old Princess Charlotte, in a white dress, golden blonde hair, those unmistakable Spencer features that everyone immediately recognizes as Diana's. The entire hall went silent, and then Anne spoke. She did not hedge. She did not soften it with diplomatic language. She declared in front of the entire family and the royal household that she was bestowing upon Princess Charlotte what she called the Diana honorific title. Her exact words were that Charlotte would be the inheritor of the spirit of compassion, courage, and closeness to the people that her grandmother once represented. And then she opened that red velvet box and revealed the tiara. This was not just any tiara. This was a piece intimately connected to Diana, one she had worn during her most meaningful charity tours. The kind of events where she was photographed holding children affected by landmines, or sitting with AIDS patients at a time when the stigma around that disease was still crushing. This tiara carried the weight of everything Diana represented during her public life. The warmth, the humanitarian work, and also the silent pain that the public had witnessed throughout her marriage and divorce. Anne placed it in Charlotte's hands and said it would serve as a reminder that Diana's legacy lives on within the family. Now scattered applause broke out, mixed with what multiple sources describe as astonished whispers spreading through the hall. Kate gripped William's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, trying to maintain a composed smile while her eyes showed clear surprise. King Charles sat in the center with this incredibly complex expression, like a man who could not decide whether he was moved by the tribute to his late ex-wife, or absolutely terrified of what was about to happen next. And then what happened next happened. Camilla shot up from her seat. The chair actually creaked behind her from the force of it. Her face went red, not with emotion, not with tears, but with what witnesses describe as an uncontrollable explosion of rage. Her voice cut through the solemn atmosphere, and I mean cut, shrill, and sharp enough that people physically flinched. She yelled that it was completely unacceptable, that Anne had no right to decide this on her own, and that she demanded it be cancelled immediately. Then she said, "The tiara does not belong to anyone in this young generation." That sentence right there is where Camilla may have accidentally revealed more than she intended. Because the question that immediately follows is, why does not it belong to this generation? Who exactly does Camilla think it belongs to? And why is she so viscerally enraged by the idea of Diana's granddaughter receiving a piece of jewelry connected to her grandmother's charitable work? The intensity of that reaction does not match the surface-level objection. If this was really just about protocol, about Anne not going through the proper channels or not consulting the queen consort before making a decision, you would expect irritation, maybe a frosty statement later, some passive-aggressive comments to the press. You would not expect someone to lose control in front of hundreds of people, pointing and trembling and shouting about how Diana is gone and everyone needs to look toward the future instead of digging up the painful past. That is not a protocol objection. That is panic. And here is the thing that makes Anne's response so fascinating. She did not react. She stood completely motionless, unfazed, looking at Camilla with cold, resolute eyes. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly in what multiple people describe as a faint smile that almost no one noticed. That smile is everything. That is not the smile of someone who just got publicly attacked. That is the smile of someone who has been waiting for exactly this reaction, who set a trap and watched the target walk directly into it. William, standing nearby, reportedly felt his heart pounding because he realized in that moment that this was never just a ceremony. His aunt was doing something much bigger than honoring his daughter. She was sending a message to the entire institution that Diana's legacy could not be erased so easily. And she was doing it in the most public, undeniable way possible. Charlotte, meanwhile, this 11-year-old girl standing in the middle of a room full of adults having what amounts to an emotional meltdown, clutched Anne's hand and whispered, asking if she had done something wrong. Anne leaned down and told her no, that she was doing everything right, and that her grandmother would be proud of her. That moment, that quiet exchange between Anne and Charlotte while the room was still frozen in shock, might be the most genuine thing that happened in that hall all day. So that is the ceremony. That is the public explosion. But what makes this entire situation genuinely compelling is not the confrontation itself. It is everything that led up to it. The months of quiet investigation that Anne had been conducting, the information she had gathered, and the pattern of behavior she had uncovered that stretches back decades. Because Princess Anne did not wake up one morning and decide to drop a tiara bombshell on her family for no reason. She had been building toward this for at least 6 months. After the ceremony ended and the press started flooding the news with headlines about the confrontation, Anne returned to her private quarters at Buckingham Palace. She sat down in an old armchair, let out a deep sigh, and told her longtime assistant something that reveals exactly how calculated this all was. She said, finally, it has begun, and that she had waited for this day for a very long time. Over the previous 6 months, Anne had been quietly contacting old palace insiders, checking archives, gathering information in the most discreet way possible, all of it serving one goal: bringing Diana's legacy back into the light. She told her assistant explicitly that she was not doing this out of personal anger, that she was doing it for justice, because Diana had been forgotten for far too long. And then she started laying out what her investigation had uncovered. And this is where the story gets genuinely disturbing. Over the years, numerous documents, personal letters, and important items of Diana had mysteriously disappeared from the royal archives. We are talking about letters Diana wrote to William and Harry when they were young, pieces of jewelry she wore during hospital visits and trips to impoverished areas, personal diaries, private photos. All of it vanished without a trace. Anne checked the archive records and found that many files were clearly documented as existing in 1998, again in 2005, and even as late as 2012. But when she checked recently, they were completely gone. No transfer records, no explanations, no paper trail showing where anything went. Just emptiness where important historical documents used to be. That is not an accident. Archives do not just lose things, especially not royal archives that are meticulously catalogued and maintained. And the specific items that went missing: letters from Diana to her sons, jewelry from her charity work, personal diaries. These are not random documents that someone might have misfiled. These are the items that would paint the fullest picture of who Diana was as a person, and what she meant to the public. Anne's conclusion was blunt. Someone deliberately tried to erase Diana's influence to turn her into a sad chapter in royal history, just an unhappy wife, rather than a symbol of compassion and courage that inspired millions of people. Anne stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden, and recalled her relationship with Diana. It had been complex. They were not best friends, but there was always mutual respect. Diana had dared to speak out about landmines, about AIDS, about the world's poorest children. She had brought light to genuinely dark places. And after her death, Anne believed someone wanted to completely turn off that light. Now at this point, Anne did not have concrete evidence naming anyone specifically. She told her assistant she could feel it, that this was not the action of one person, but a system maintained for many years, and that she would not allow it to continue. William showed up at her door shortly after, still in his suit from the ceremony, worried about the uproar, and asking if she really thought this was reasonable. Anne looked at him and said something that cuts to the heart of this entire situation. She told him that he was Diana's son, that he understood better than anyone what she endured because of Camilla, and that if they did not stand up to protect her legacy now, Charlotte and future grandchildren would only know their grandmother through edited stories. She said she did not want history to repeat the same mistakes. William did not argue. He stood there silently for a long time, feeling the still raw pain within the family. But he did not oppose his aunt. He just nodded and left. That conversation matters because it shows that this is not just Anne on a crusade. William, Diana's eldest son, the future king, heard his aunt's reasoning and could not bring himself to disagree. The pain is still there decades later, and the idea that someone has been systematically erasing his mother's memory clearly resonates with him on a level that overrides concerns about family unity or public scandal. But where did Anne's suspicions actually start? What turned this from a vague sense that something was wrong into a focused investigation with specific targets? That traces back to a meeting several months before the ceremony. And this meeting is where the story shifts from suspicion to something much more concrete. It was a drizzly afternoon at a quiet house on the outskirts of London. Anne arrived alone, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a dark coat to avoid recognition. The man waiting for her was in his late 70s, white hair, slightly hunched from age and decades of palace service. His name was Robert Harrington, and he had served as a butler to Princess Diana for more than 10 years. When Anne sat down, he looked around carefully before speaking, his voice cautious. He told her he had thought long and hard before daring to contact her, that what he was about to say could put him in danger, but that he could not take it to his grave. Robert laid out a timeline that makes the pattern of erasing unmistakable. He explained that after Diana's divorce from Prince Charles in 1996, many of her personal documents and items began to be systematically retrieved. Handwritten letters Diana wrote to her sons, personal diaries, photos from charity trips, gifts from heads of state, all of it removed on orders from higher-ups. Robert was specific. It was not a one-time thing. It was a series of orders. At first, the justification was protecting privacy. Later, the claim was that they were reorganizing the archives. But Robert knew better. Items were taken away and never returned. After Diana died in 1997, the situation became even more severe. Staff members who had worked closely with Diana and knew too much began to be transferred to other positions or quietly forced to resign under vague pretexts. Some were indirectly threatened, told that if they spoke about what they had seen, their careers and reputations would be destroyed. Robert was lucky to stay longer because he knew how to stay silent. But he told Anne his conscience had tormented him for 20 years. Anne listened without interrupting, and her face gradually hardened. She could sense the genuine fear in this elderly man's voice. He did not have physical evidence, but his account was extremely logical and detailed, matching the irregularities Anne had long suspected. And Robert was direct about who he believed was responsible. He suspected Camilla was involved. Only Camilla, he believed, had the motive to do all of this. When he finished, he looked at Anne with tired but determined eyes and said Diana was a good person who did so much for the country, and he could not bear to see her legacy erased day by day. She deserved to be remembered as a symbol, not merely a tragedy. Anne held his hand and promised she would not let what he told her be in vain. That meeting was the turning point. Anne realized this was not the impulsive action of one individual. It was a years-long systematic campaign to diminish Diana's image and influence within the royal family. From that day forward, Anne began acting more decisively, gathering more information, contacting additional former witnesses, making long-term plans. She understood that words alone would not be enough. There had to be concrete, powerful public action to change the situation. That was exactly why she decided to organize the tiara ceremony for Charlotte. She wanted to present Diana's granddaughter to the public as a living symbol of the values Diana had represented, and she knew the decision would cause turmoil. But after hearing Robert's words, she was convinced that if she did nothing now, Diana's legacy would be buried in darkness forever. Now, while Anne was building her case, Camilla was not sitting idle. After the ceremony, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace became stifling. Camilla had received intelligence from her trusted sources that Anne was not just organizing ceremonies impulsively. She was conducting a deep investigation into Diana's past. In her private room, Camilla paced restlessly, her face pale, her eyes flashing with anxiety and rage. She knew that if Anne kept digging, everything she had tried to bury for 2 decades could be exposed. Camilla's response was swift and methodical. First, she ordered her 2 most trusted assistants to carry out what was described as a final cleanup. Within 2 days, the last remaining records related to Diana, old archive notes, personal photos, disappeared completely from the royal archive system. No transfer traces were left behind. Everything was handled quickly, discreetly, and thoroughly. Next, she moved to warning tactics. Former witnesses that Anne was known to be contacting started receiving strange phone calls, cold voices telling them they had retired peacefully and should not dredge up old stories. That silence would be better for their health and their families. At the same time, Camilla prepared a backup plan, quietly drafting internal documents that placed all responsibility on a senior secretary who had left more than 15 years earlier, someone who had passed away 2 years ago and could not defend himself or speak out. If the matter were exposed, Camilla would claim it was merely that secretary's personal mistake and that she had known nothing about it. After completing all these measures, Camilla felt temporarily reassured. She believed all traces had been erased, that nothing could lead back to her. Regaining her calm, she began a public counterattack at an internal royal family meeting a few days later. She criticized Anne in front of everyone, saying her actions were extremely thoughtless, that reviving Diana's image only further divided the family, that they needed unity, and to look toward the future rather than living forever in the shadow of the past. She also argued that granting the tiara to Charlotte without going through the current queen consort was an overstep of authority she could not accept. Every word was carefully calculated, showing concern for unity while implicitly warning Anne that she would not be easily bullied. But here is the thing about trying to erase evidence when someone is actively investigating you. You can never be completely sure you got everything. And Camilla had no idea that her counteractions were about to make Anne more determined, or that the evidence she thought she had erased still existed in the darkest corners. After Camilla's countermoves, Anne was not intimidated. The queen consort's aggression only strengthened her resolve. She understood that stopping now would mean everything falling into permanent silence. In the following days, she continued her search, contacting numerous former staff members who had worked directly with Diana in the 1990s. She met them in discreet locations, suburban cafes, quiet parks, even in cars parked in underground lots. At first, The results were disappointing. Most were willing to speak, but none dared keep physical evidence. An elderly former maid cried as she recounted watching boxes of documents being carried away in the middle of the night, but she said she was just a maid and could not dare keep anything. Another butler trembled as he explained that they told him if he kept quiet, he would have a peaceful retirement, and he had a family to think about. Anne listened patiently to every story. Although they were only verbal accounts, they reinforced her belief that there had been a systematic campaign to erase Diana's legacy. But she needed hard evidence, something that could stand up to any investigation or denial. And then the crucial moment arrived. On a stormy evening, pouring rain, Anne met Mr. Edward Langford, a former archive assistant to Diana, who had retired in 2008. He was about 70 years old, living in a modest house in Surrey. When Anne entered, he looked at her with tired but determined eyes and said he had waited for this day for 20 years, that he knew one day the truth had to come out. Edward led Anne into a small room in the basement, opened an old safe, and took out a thick bundle of documents carefully wrapped in moisture-proof bags. Inside were photocopies of dozens of original files, notes of letter retrievals, lists of items removed, and specific instructions for thorough disposal. But the most important item was a small black USB drive. Edward explained that he had secretly recorded a meeting in 2005 when he was still working in the archives. He had hidden a recorder in his jacket pocket because he suspected something was wrong. Anne plugged the USB into her laptop, and as the recording played, the air in the room seemed to freeze. A woman's voice, clear and cold, echoed through the speakers. Dispose of everything. All letters, photos, and items related to Diana. Leave nothing that could remind the public of her. This is an order from above. I do not want to see them resurface. It was Camilla's voice. This was 2005, the year she married Charles and formally entered the royal family. Anne sat motionless, gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from a mixture of rage and satisfaction. After months of persistence, she finally had what she needed: irrefutable evidence. Edward provided additional detailed testimony, clearly identifying who had carried out the orders and how the chain of command had worked. The pieces from other witnesses Anne had met earlier began fitting together perfectly, forming a clear picture of a years-long campaign to erase Diana's image. When she left Edward's house that night, Anne clutched the bundle of documents tightly. The rain was still pouring, but she later told her assistant her heart had never felt brighter. With this concrete evidence, she knew she had secured victory. It was only a matter of choosing the right moment to bring everything into the light. That moment, of course, was the ceremony for Charlotte. Anne orchestrated the entire thing, knowing exactly how Camilla would react, knowing the public confrontation would force the issue into the open, and knowing she had the evidence to back up everything she was implying. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Charles convened an important internal royal family meeting in a private conference room attended only by core members. The tension was suffocating from the first minutes. Anne stood up, her demeanor more resolute than ever, and formally proposed that the royal family recognized Charlotte's title and role as the inheritor of the compassionate spirit her grandmother once represented. Camilla slammed her hand on the table, her voice shrill, accusing Anne of causing trouble and playing games. The atmosphere immediately exploded. William tried to intervene, but was too late. Charles had to call for calm, but everyone could feel the storm approaching. That evening, Charles decided to hold a private confrontation with only Anne, Camilla, and a few key members. There was no room for evasion. Anne entered, carrying a thick folder of documents, her eyes determined. She said it was time to clarify everything, that she was not doing this to create division, but to protect the truth. She placed the entire set of documents on the table. Then she played the recording. Camilla's voice from 20 years earlier, rang out clearly in the deathly silent room. Dispose of everything. All letters, photos, and items related to Diana. Leave nothing. This is an order. Camilla's face turned deathly pale. She tried to stay calm, but her trembling hands gave her away. Charles listened, his face gradually showing deep disappointment, and continued presenting each piece of evidence logically and coldly. Photocopy documents, retrieval notes, witness lists, detailed testimonies from multiple former staff members. All of it pointed to one undeniable truth. The systematic erasing of Diana's legacy had been carried out for many years under direct orders from Camilla. Anne emphasized that this was not the action of a secretary, that there was a clear chain of command, with traces leading straight to the person who gave the orders. Camilla tried to defend herself, her voice faltering. She claimed it was a misunderstanding, that everyone was exaggerating, but the blame-shifting plan she had prepared earlier collapsed completely. The evidence was too detailed, too clear. There were no gaps left for her to deny. Every time Camilla tried to explain, and Anne presented another document or recording, it rendered her excuses meaningless. Charles finally spoke, his voice weary but firm. He told Camilla she had gone too far, that he could not believe this. The atmosphere in the room became so heavy that everyone found it difficult to breathe. Camilla sat silently, no longer having the strength to argue. She knew everything was over. The fear she had tried to bury for 2 decades had finally been exposed. Subscribe to Royal Daily Report for breaking palace developments and exclusive royal family analysis. The outcome was delivered in silence. The royal family decided not to make the matter public to avoid a major scandal, but internally, everything changed. Camilla was completely isolated. She was forced to move to live alone in the eastern wing of the palace, and was barred from participating in any official royal activities. For the foreseeable future, her reputation and position within the family were severely damaged. Anne stood by the window after the meeting, looking out at the darkness enveloping the garden. She did not cheer in victory. There was only a mixture of relief and sadness. She had done what needed to be done. William approached his aunt and spoke softly, telling her she was right, but that the price was very high, and smiled sadly, and replied that sometimes to heal, we must face the darkness, and that Diana deserved to be honored. Charlotte, she said, would continue that journey. The truth had been revealed, not through leaks or scandals or tabloid speculation, but through methodical investigation and a carefully planned public ceremony that forced the issue into the open. Diana's legacy would no longer be buried in silence. Through Charlotte, the flame that Diana had once lit was finally passed on to a new generation, one that would not allow history to repeat the same mistakes. The storm within the royal family may have temporarily subsided, but the echoes of what Anne uncovered will linger for a very long time. And honestly, the most remarkable part of this entire situation is that it took one person willing to ask questions that everyone else was too afraid or too comfortable to ask. Anne spent months tracking down witnesses, gathering documents, and building a case that ultimately revealed a 2-decade campaign to erase a woman who had meant so much to so many people. The tiara was never really about jewelry. It was about forcing the truth into the light, and that is everything. Royal Daily Report, your trusted source for palace truth, breaking news, and exclusive royal family coverage. Subscribe now and stay informed.